The dust of redemption, Wyoming, has a special kind of cruelty. It clings to everything, a fine, gritty powder the color of faded bone, a constant reminder of the parched land and the even drier souls of its inhabitants. Alara feels it on her skin, in her throat, in the heavy silence that follows her down the main street. She walks with her head held high, a discipline learned over long, lonely months, but she can feel the eyes on her back, sharp and venomous as snake bites. The swell of her belly beneath her worn calico dress is a beacon for their scorn, a public declaration of a sin they relish condemning. It's the whispers that are worst. They catch on the wind like burrs, snagging in her mind. Indians' leave-ins. Shameless. Look at her, bold as brass. She tries to block them out, focusing on the careful placement of her worn boots, on the list of meager supplies she needs from the mercantile. Flour, salt, maybe a bit of bacon if the storekeep is feeling charitable, which he rarely is. Today, the whispers are louder. A new family has arrived in town, the Crawfords, all pinched faces and pious pronouncements. Mrs. Crawford, a woman built like a fortress of judgment, stands with her two cronies outside the mercantile, their bonnets clustered together like a flock of vultures. As Alara approaches, their conversation drops to a conspiratorial hiss, but not so low that she can't hear. "It's an abomination," Mrs. Crawford declares, her voice carrying with the clear, cutting authority of the self-righteous. "To bring such a creature into a Christian town. A half-breed." Alara's hands clench at her sides. Her child, her baby. They speak of the tiny, innocent life within her, as if it's a blight, a contamination. A deep, protective fire flares in her chest, so hot it almost chokes her. She wants to scream, to rail against their ignorance, to tell them of Hinto, her husband, of his gentle strength and the honor in his heart, 100 times that of any man in this wretched town. But she knows it's useless. Their minds are as barren as the surrounding plains, and her words would be seeds scattered on stone. She pushes past them, her shoulder brushing against one of the women, who recoils with a theatrical gasp as if Alara were plagued. Inside the mercantile, the air is thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and unspoken censure. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, watches her with weary eyes, his face a mask of practiced neutrality that does little to hide his disapproval. She is a disruption to the town's placid surface of hypocrisy, and for that, he resents her. A man stands by the counter, his back to her. He is tall, dressed in a fine but unadorned black coat that speaks of a different world, a world of cities and order. He is examining a display of new steel plows, but Alara feels his stillness, a quality of listening that is different from the avid curiosity of the gossips. It is a weighted, thoughtful silence. She gathers her things, her movements stiff with the effort of ignoring the glares. Flour, salt, a small tin of lard. No bacon today. Her coin purse feels perilously light. As she places the items on the counter, a wave of dizziness washes over her, a sudden, hollowing weakness from the heat and the strain. Her hand slips, and the heavy sack of flour tumbles from the counter, bursting open on the dusty floorboards. A cloud of white erupts, coating her boots and the hem of her dress. From outside, a peal of derisive laughter rings out. Mrs. Crawford's cackle is the loudest. Clumsy as she is sinful, the woman crows, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Tears of shame and fury prick Alara's eyes. She blinks them back fiercely, kneeling on the dirty floor, her hands trembling as she tries to scoop the precious flour back into the ruined sack. It's hopeless. Most of it is fouled with dirt and grit. That was flour for a week's worth of bread. The loss is a physical blow, a knot of despair tightening in her gut. Then a shadow falls over her. She looks up, expecting to see Henderson's annoyed face. Instead, it is the tall stranger in the black coat. He has turned from the plows, and his face is not what she expected. It is lean, etched with lines of thought rather than labor, and his eyes, a clear, startling gray, are fixed not on the mess at her feet, but on the women outside. There's a look in them she has never seen directed at her before, a cold, intellectual anger, precise and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He says nothing to her. He simply steps past her, his movements economical and deliberate, and pushes the mercantile door open. He stands on the threshold, a formidable silhouette against the bright glare of the sun. The women's laughter falters and dies under his silent scrutiny. "Was there something amusing, ladies?" he asks. His voice is calm, deep, and carries an unmistakable weight of command. It is not the voice of a rancher or a drifter. It is the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Crawford, flustered, puffs herself up. "We were just remarking on the general state of things, Judge Finch." Judge. The title hangs in the air, changing everything. Alara freezes, still kneeling in the cloud of her own misfortune. Judge Alastair Finch's gaze remains level. "The general state of things seems to be that a pregnant woman has had an accident, and your response is to mock her from the street like a pack of scavenging coyotes. Is it the standard of Christian charity you aspire to, Mrs. Crawford?" The woman's face models with indignation and surprise. She and her friends are speechless. They're used to being the arbiters of morality in redemption, not the subjects of its reprimand. The judge turns his back on them without waiting for an answer, a dismissal more profound than any insult. He closes the door and walks to the counter, his eyes finally meeting Alara's. For the first time, she sees past the authority to the man. There is a deep, abiding weariness in his expression, the look of someone who has seen the worst of humanity and is not surprised, only disappointed. He reaches into his coat, places a silver dollar on the counter, more than enough to cover everything, including the ruined flower. And then he does something that shocks her more than his public defense. He kneels, right there on the filthy floor, his fine black trousers sinking into the dust and spilled flour. He looks at her, his gray eyes direct and devoid of pity. "Allow me," he says, his voice softer now. And with 3 words, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. Then shift to past tense for the main body of the story. The silence that followed his words was more profound than the noise that had preceded them. Alara stared at him, this man of law and letters, kneeling in the common dirt of a store as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't wait for her permission. With his long, capable hands, he began gathering the edges of the split sack, his movements efficient and utterly without condescension. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, scurried from behind his counter with a broom and dustpan, his face a comical mixture of awe and panic at having a federal judge cleaning his floor. "No, please, Judge, I'll handle it," Henderson stammered, his earlier indifference forgotten. Judge Alastair Finch paid him no mind. He looked at Alara. "You should stand up. The floor is no place for you." He said it not as an order, but as a statement of fact, his voice holding a quiet concern that unnerved her more than the town's open hostility. Slowly, her limbs stiff and trembling, she rose. The judge stood with her, dusting the white powder from his trousers with an air of detached annoyance, as if it were a minor inconvenience and not a breach of the rigid social order of redemption. He turned to Henderson. "A new sack of flour for the lady," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And add a side of bacon to her order. Put it all on my account." He then picked up her basket of goods, his gesture so swift and certain she had no time to protest. He held it as if it weighed nothing. "I will see you home," he stated, once again framing it as an inevitability rather than a request. Alara found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "You don't have to do that, sir. I'm aware of what I do and do not have to do," he replied, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her pale face and the faint tremor in her hands. "Nevertheless, I will." The walk to her small, rented room at the edge of town was a gauntlet of silent stairs. The story of what happened in the mercantile had already spread with the speed of a prairie fire. Mrs. Crawford and her companions had scurried away, but every curtain seemed to twitch as they passed. Every man loafing on a porch fell silent, watching the town's most powerful resident acting as a porter for its most despised outcast. The weight of their judgment was immense, a physical pressure in the air, but Alastair Finch seemed impervious to it. He walked with a steady, measured gait, his back ramrod straight, the basket in his hand. He was a bulwark, and for those few hundred yards, Ilara felt, for the first time in months, as if she were walking in the lee of a great rock wall, sheltered from the harshest of the wind. Her room was in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was directly proportional to the rent she charged. The room was small, airless, with a single window that looked out onto a dusty alley. It was all Ilara could afford. When they reached her door, she fumbled for the key, her fingers still unsteady. He set the basket down. The narrow hallway felt crowded with his presence. "Mrs." he began, then stopped, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Callahan," she supplied quietly. "Ilara Callahan." "Mrs. Callahan." He corrected himself, a slight inclination of his head. "I trust you have what you need for the time being." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Finch, for the flour. For everything." The words felt inadequate, flimsy things to offer in exchange for the public stand he had taken on her behalf. He seemed to sense her discomfort. His formal demeanor softened almost imperceptibly. "Injustice is a weed, Mrs. Callahan. If it is not pulled up by the roots when it is small, it will choke the life out of a place." He paused, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Get some rest. The heat is formidable today." With another brief nod, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Ilara alone in the silence, the scent of fresh flour and bacon filling her small room. She sank onto the lumpy mattress of her bed, her heart hammering a confused rhythm against her ribs. He had not offered pity. He had offered something far more dangerous, far more potent: respect. And in a town like Redemption, that was an act of rebellion. Alastair Finch returned to the quiet solitude of the house he had rented on the west side of town, a large two-story structure that was far too big for one man. It had belonged to the previous judge, who had died of consumption, and it still held the faint, lingering air of disuse and sorrow. He had come to Redemption 3 months prior, appointed by the territorial governor to bring a more structured form of federal law to this fractious corner of Wyoming. He was a man who believed in systems, in precedents, in the clear, uncluttered logic of the statutes he had spent his life studying. He had been a widower for 5 years, his wife, Mary, taken by a fever that had swept through Philadelphia. Their life together had been one of quiet intellectual companionship and gentle affection. Her absence was a constant, hollow ache, a silence in the house that no amount of work could fill. He had accepted the posting to Wyoming as an escape, a way to trade the ghosts of the city for the stark emptiness of the frontier. He had expected hardship, violence, and greed. He had not expected the particular brand of petty, suffocating cruelty he'd witnessed today. His encounter with Ilara Callahan troubled him. It was an anomaly, a variable that did not fit neatly into his ledgers of law and order. He had acted on an impulse, a flash of pure, unadulterated anger at the smug viciousness of those women. It was not a calculated legal maneuver. It was a deeply human reaction, and that in itself was disturbing to a man who prided himself on his detachment. He sat in his study, surrounded by his leather-bound books, the tools of his trade. He tried to focus on a land dispute case, but the image of the young woman kneeling in the spilled flour kept superimposing itself over the legal text. He saw the defiant tilt of her chin, the fierce pride in her eyes, even as she was being humiliated, the way her hand rested instinctively, protectively, on the swell of her belly. He was a judge. His role was to be impartial, to weigh evidence. But the evidence of his own eyes was clear. Here was a person being tried and convicted by a jury of gossips for a crime that did not exist. Over the next week, Alastair found his routines subtly altered by an awareness of her. He saw her from his window once, walking to the well, her steps slow and heavy. He saw the way other townsfolk would give her a wide berth, as if she carried a contagion. He heard her name mentioned with a sneer at the hotel, where he sometimes took his evening meal. The town's persecution was relentless, a slow, grinding pressure designed to crush her spirit or drive her out. His concern, at first a vague, abstract sense of injustice, began to solidify into something more concrete. He made a few discreet inquiries. He learned from a clerk that her husband, a Lakota man named Hinto, had worked for a time on the railroad before succumbing to cholera the previous winter. He had been, by all accounts, a quiet and hard-working man. Alara had come to redemption with what little they had saved, hoping to find a place to have her child in peace. She had found the opposite. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to tear the sky apart. Rain lashed against his windows, and the wind howled around the eaves of the big, empty house. Alistair sat by the fire, reading, when a sudden, frantic knocking echoed through the house. It was late, well past 10. He opened the door to find Mrs. Gable, Alara's landlady, her shawl pulled tight around her, her face pinched with alarm. "Judge, you've got to do something," she cried over the roar of the wind. "It's the Callahan woman. She's took ill. A fever, and she's in a terrible state. I can't have her dying in my house, Judge. It ain't proper." The woman's panic was rooted not in concern for Alara, but in the social inconvenience of having a death, especially her death, under her roof. Alistair's blood ran cold. He grabbed his coat. "Have you sent for the doctor?" Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "Doc Adams." He was hesitant, Judge. Said he was busy with old Mr. Carruthers' gout. He said he'd try to look in on her in the morning. Fury, cold and sharp, sliced through Alistair. In the morning might be too late. "You will go to Dr. Adams' house right now," he commanded, his voice steely with an authority that made the woman flinch. "You will tell him that Judge Alistair Finch requires his immediate attendance. Tell him if he is not at your boarding house in 15 minutes, he will find himself explaining his professional negligence in my courtroom. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and scurried off into the rain. Alistair didn't wait. He strode through the storm, the rain soaking his coat, his mind racing. He found Alara's room, the door slightly ajar. The air inside was stifling and smelled of sickness. She was lying on the bed, her face flushed, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was shivering violently despite the oppressive heat in the room. He touched her forehead. It was burning. "Mrs. Callahan," he said gently. Alara, her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever, and for a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. "Hinto," she murmured. The name is soft, broken sound. Then her vision cleared, and a flicker of awareness, of fear, crossed her face. "Judge, the doctor is on his way," he said, his voice calm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the storm raging both outside and within him. He looked around the wretched little room. There was a bucket of water by the bed, but no clean cloths. The single sheet on her bed was damp with sweat. It was a place to be sick, a place to die, not a place to heal. He acted without thinking, his legal mind supplanted by a more fundamental human imperative. He went to her small trunk, opened it, and found a clean chemise. He poured water into the basin, dipped the cloth, and began to bathe her face and wrists, gently, methodically, trying to bring the fever down. She was too weak to protest, watching him with wide, confused eyes. When Doc Adams finally arrived, flustered and grumbling, he found the federal judge sitting by Alara's bedside, holding a cool cloth to her forehead. The sight was so astonishing it shocked the doctor into silence. He examined her quickly, his manner now brisk and professional under the judge's unwavering gaze. "It's a lung fever," he diagnosed, pulling a vial of laudanum and a packet of quinine powder from his bag. "Dangerous, especially in her condition. She needs constant care, broth, water, and this medicine every 4 hours. And she can't stay here. This room is an incubator for illness." Alistair looked at the damp, peeling walls at the single grimy window. The doctor was right. To leave her here will be a death sentence. A decision formed in his mind, swift and absolute, a judgment rendered not on a case, but on a life. He looked at the doctor, then at Mrs. Gable, who hovered in the doorway. "She won't be staying here," he announced. "She'll be coming with me. My house has more than enough room, and I can ensure she receives the care she needs." Mrs. Gable looked relieved. Doc Adams looked stunned, but it was Alara's expression that held him. Through the haze of fever, she stared at him, a silent question in her eyes. It was a question that asked more than why. It asked, "What do you want?" A question born of a life where every act of kindness from a stranger had a hidden price. Alistair met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. A man of the law cannot stand by and watch a preventable tragedy unfold, he said, his words directed as much to himself as to her. It's a matter of simple justice. He arranged for 2 men to carry her on a makeshift litter through the now subsiding rain to his house. He set her up in the downstairs guest room, a spacious, airy chamber with clean linens and a window that looked out onto a small, neglected garden. He paid a hefty sum to one of the more discreet women in town to come and sit with her during the day, to feed her broth and ensure she took her medicine. But at night, he took the vigil himself. For 3 nights, he sat in a chair by her bed, reading his law books by the low light of an oil lamp. The quiet scratch of his pen as he made notes the only sound besides her labored breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. During her fevered dreams, she would sometimes cry out, muttering names and words in a language he didn't understand. Lakota, he presumed. She spoke of a flowing river, of a winter sky full of stars, of a man named Hinto. In these unguarded moments, Alistair felt as though he were glimpsing fragments of a life, of a love that the town of redemption had already condemned without a hearing. He saw the strength in her, the deep well of resilience that had carried her this far. He saw the profound grief she carried for the husband she had lost. He was a man of facts and evidence, and the facts were these. She was a good woman who had been dealt a cruel hand. She was a widow, not a harlot. She was a mother-to-be, not a sinner. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He came into the room as dawn was painting the sky in pale shades of rose and gray, and found her awake, her eyes clear for the first time in days. The flush was gone from her cheeks, leaving her pale and weak, but the life had returned to her gaze. She watched him as he approached the bed. "You're in my house, Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly, answering the question in her eyes. "You've been very ill." She struggled to sit up, her breath catching in her throat. "You brought me here." "It was necessary," he said simply. He poured her a glass of water, holding it to her lips. She drank, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why?" she whispered, the word fragile in the quiet room. Alistair considered the question. He could have given her the same answer he'd given the doctor, the one about justice. He could have framed it as a legal or moral abstraction. But sitting there, in the intimate quiet of the sick room, with the morning light falling on her tired face, such answers felt hollow, dishonest. He set the glass down and looked at her directly. "Because my house is large and empty," he said, his voice low and candid. "And my conscience would not allow me to leave you in a place where you might die for lack of a clean sheet and a dose of medicine." He paused, his next words costing him more than the first. "And because I'm tired of the silence in this house." It was a confession, stark and unadorned. It was the truest thing he had said in a very long time. In that moment, the formal barrier between them, judge and outcast, protector and victim, crumbled into dust. He was no longer just a man of the law. He was Alistair, a lonely widower. And she was not just a problem to be solved. She was Alara, a woman fighting for her life and the life of her child. She lay back against the pillows, her expression unreadable. She did not thank him. Instead, she said, "The women in town, they will talk." "Let them talk," Alistair said, a surprising firmness in his own voice. "Their words are air. They have no power here." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Words had power. They were stones, and in a town like Redemption, enough of them could build a wall or bury a person alive. And by bringing her under his roof, Alistair had not ended the siege. He had simply moved himself inside the fortress with her. The arrangement was, on its surface, a practical one. Alara needed a place to recover and await the birth of her child. Alistair, a man who lived on poorly prepared meals from the hotel and whose house was a monument to dust and neglect, needed a housekeeper. They framed it as such, a transaction of convenience. It was a fiction that allowed them both to maintain a semblance of propriety, a shield against the town's inevitable speculation. As Alara regained her strength, a new rhythm established itself in the quiet house. In the mornings, she would rise early, her movements still slow but growing steadier each day. She would prepare a simple breakfast, and they would eat in the formal dining room, sitting at opposite ends of the long, polished table, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts. He was formal, almost painfully so, addressing her as Mrs. Callahan. She was quiet and reserved, her answers to his polite inquiries about her health brief and direct. But action spoke where words failed. She began to transform the house. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual reclaiming of the space from its shroud of masculine solitude. She aired out the musty rooms, polished the tarnished silver, and mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found the neglected garden out back and, with a quiet determination, began to tend it, pulling weeds and coaxing green shoots from the dry soil. She did not do it as a servant earning her keep, but with the focused care of someone making a home. Alistair watched her, his practiced attachment slowly eroding. He would come home from his chambers at the courthouse and find the air filled with the scent of baking bread, a smell he hadn't experienced since Mary was alive. He would find a vase of wildflowers on his study desk. These small, silent offerings were more intimate than any conversation they'd had. They were a language of gratitude, of shared space, of a life being lived within the walls that had for so long only contained an existence. He, in turn, found ways to care for her. He made sure the pantry was always stocked with good food. He bought her 2 new dresses of sturdy, respectable wool, leaving the package on her bed without a word. When he saw her struggling to carry a bucket of water from the well, he had a pump installed in the kitchen, an unheard-of luxury in redemption. He told her it was a practical improvement for the property, but she saw the truth in his eyes. It was for her. The town, of course, watched and whispered. Their arrangement was a scandal, a juicy morsel of gossip to be chewed over at the mercantile and the sewing circle. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as flexible as the town's prevailing opinion, paid Alistair a visit. "Judge," he'd begun, shifting his weight uneasily on the porch. "Folks are concerned about the propriety of the situation." Alistair had looked at him with his cool, gray eyes. "Are they concerned, Sheriff? Or are they merely titillated? And is there a law in the books in this territory against employing a housekeeper?" "No, sir, of course not. But, given her reputation—" "Her reputation," Alistair had interrupted, his voice dangerously soft, "is the product of vicious gossip and unchristian prejudice, which you, as the chief lawman of this town, have done nothing to quell. Mrs. Callahan is a respectable widow under my protection. If I hear of any man or woman harassing her, I will consider it a personal affront, and I will use the full weight of my office to address it. Is that clear?" The sheriff had stammered an affirmative and made a hasty retreat. The message was sent. The open mockery ceased, replaced by a sullen, simmering resentment. Alara was now untouchable, but she was more isolated than ever, a prisoner in the gilded cage of the judge's house. One evening, as her time grew near, a change occurred. Alistair came into the sitting room to find her not darning or cleaning, but working on something of her own. She held a small piece of soft, brain-tanned deer hide in her lap, and with a porcupine quill and a thread of sinew, she was creating an intricate pattern of beads. Her fingers, so capable with a needle and thread, moved with a different kind of grace, a familiarity that was almost reverent. The colors were vibrant, sky blue, sun yellow, a deep, earthy red. He stood in the doorway, silent, watching her. The intensity of her focus, the quiet love she was pouring into this small object, was mesmerizing. He realized what she was making, a baby moccasin, a tiny, perfect shoe decorated with symbols he didn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. It was a piece of her husband's heritage, a gift for their child. It was an act of defiance, a quiet declaration that she would not erase Hinto's memory, that their child would know both sides of its identity. She looked up, startled, as if caught in a private act of worship. She quickly tried to hide the moccasin under a cloth. "Please," Alistair said, his voice gentle. "Don't stop. It's beautiful." She hesitated, then slowly brought it back into view. "It is a Lakota design," she said softly, "for a strong heart." He stepped closer, sitting in the chair opposite her. "Tell me about him," he said, not as a judge seeking facts, but as a man asking about a man. And for the first time she did. She spoke of Hinto, of his kindness, his humor, his reverence for the natural world. She described the life they had shared in a small cabin near the railroad camp, a life of hardship made rich by love. As she spoke, the guarded, weary woman Alistair had come to know receded, replaced by a younger, more vibrant version of herself, her face softened by memory and love. He saw the woman Hinto had cherished, and in that moment, Alistair felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar in his own chest. It was not pity. It was a profound, aching respect, mingled with an emotion he could not yet name. It felt like loneliness, but a different kind, a loneliness for a future he had never considered. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man named Silas Croft. Croft was a wealthy and influential rancher whose land claim Alistair had recently ruled against in favor of a group of smaller homesteaders. The ruling had been legally sound, but had earned him Croft's undying enmity. Croft was a cruel, arrogant man who saw the world in terms of power, and he now saw Alistair's unconventional household as a weakness to be exploited. He began a campaign of insidious rumors, far more damaging than the simple-minded gossip of the townswomen. He didn't just whisper about impropriety, he hinted at darker things. That the judge was a hypocrite, a man of secret depravity. That the child wasn't a Lakota's at all, but the judge's own, the product of a sordid affair. He used his influence to turn the town's resentment into active hostility. Men who had once tipped their hats to the judge now looked away. The discreet woman who had been helping Alara suddenly stopped coming, making flimsy excuses. The pressure was mounting, isolating them, turning the house into a true fortress under siege. The breaking point came on a Sunday. As Alistair and Alara were leaving the house, he on his way to his chambers for some quiet work, she to tend her garden, they were met by a small delegation. It was led by Silas Croft, his face smug with triumph. Behind him stood Sheriff Brody, looking deeply uncomfortable, and several of the town's so-called leaders, including the sanctimonious Mrs. Crawford. "Judge Finch," Croft said, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "we've come as a concerned citizenry. This situation has gone on long enough. It reflects poorly on the town and on the dignity of your office." Alistair's face became a granite mask. "My household is my private affair, Mr. Croft. Not when it becomes a public scandal." Croft shot back, emboldened. "Harboring this woman, flaunting her in the face of decent folk. It's a moral blight. We, the good people of redemption, are formally requesting that you send her away. For the good of the community." Alara, who had been standing just behind Alistair, went pale. She clutched the doorframe for support, her hand going to her belly. The raw hatred in their faces was terrifying. She saw in that moment that they would not stop. They would hound her, and they would ruin this good man who had shown her nothing but kindness. "They are right," she whispered later, after the men had gone, leaving their ultimatum hanging in the air. She was in the sitting room, her hands clenched in her lap, her face a mask of despair. "I have to leave. I cannot let them do this to you. I will not be the cause of your ruin." Alistair stood by the window, staring out at the town that had judged them both. He had listened to Croft's vile accusations, had seen the fear in Alara's eyes, and something inside him had shifted. The careful walls of logic and detachment he had built around his heart had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet dignity of the woman in the room behind him. He had offered her shelter, and in return, she had brought life back into his silent world. The thought of her leaving, of her facing the world alone with her child, of his house returning to its empty, hollow state, was unbearable. It was not a legal problem to be solved. It was a future he could not accept. He turned from the window, his decision made. It was a choice that defied logic, that invited scandal, that would forever alter the course of his life. But it was the only choice his heart and his conscience would permit. "You are not leaving, Ilera," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He crossed the room and stood before her, and for the first time, he used her given name without the formal prefix. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "They will destroy you," she said, her voice breaking. "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. "They will not. There is one way to silence them. One way to grant you and your child a protection that no gossip or threat can penetrate. A shield of law and legitimacy they will not dare to challenge." He took a deep breath. The air in the room suddenly charged electric. "They want you gone because you are a lone woman with no one to speak for you. They see me as your keeper, not your champion. We will change that." He knelt before her, just as he had knelt in the dirt and flour of the mercantile all those weeks ago. He took her trembling hands in his. "This is not how I ever imagined doing this," he said, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in his gray eyes. "And it is not born of moonlight and poetry. It is born of necessity and in a deep, abiding respect. But it is no less sincere for that." He looked directly into her soul. "Marry me, Ilera. Let them try to cast out the wife of a federal judge. Let them sling their mud at a name I will be honored to give her child. I swore to myself I would see justice done for you. This is the only way to make it absolute." He wasn't offering her a business arrangement anymore. He wasn't offering pity or charity or even just protection. In his own stark, formal way, kneeling on the floor of the sitting room that she had made a home, Alistair Finch was offering her his name, his future, his heart. He was swearing to protect them, not just with the law, but with his life. The air in the room was so still, it seemed to hum. Ilera stared at Alistair, at this impossible man kneeling before her, his strong, steady hands holding hers. The words "marry me" echoed in the space between them, not as a romantic plea, but as a declaration of war against the town of redemption. It was a legal strategy, a social shield, a gambit of breathtaking audacity. Yet, looking into his earnest gray eyes, she saw more than tactics. She saw the confession he had made in the sick room. "I am tired of the silence in this house," and understood it was the truest vow he could make. He was not just saving her from the world. He was saving himself from his own solitude. Tears she hadn't shed in the face of mockery or illness now welled in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, shattering relief. For months, she had been a ship without an anchor, tossed on a sea of cruelty. Now, here was a harbor, not just a temporary shelter, but a place to moor her life and the life of her child. She drew a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said. "Alistair, yes." His name on her lips for the first time was its own kind of vow. A look of immense relief passed over his face, softening the stern lines around his mouth. He squeezed her hands gently, then rose to his feet. The time for sentiment was over. The time for action had come. "Good," he said, his voice once again crisp and decisive, the judge taking command. "There is no time to waste. Croft and his cronies believe they have me cornered. We will turn the tables on them. The circuit preacher, Reverend Michael, is in town. He is a man of God, but more importantly, he is a man who respects the law. He will perform this ceremony." Alistair moved with a swift, purposeful energy that filled the house. He sent a note to the preacher, requesting his presence at the courthouse in 1 hour. He sent another to Sheriff Brody, not a request, but a summons, informing him that he was required to attend as an official witness to a legal proceeding of the utmost importance. He was seizing the narrative, turning what Croft intended as a private humiliation into a public and legally binding spectacle of his own making. He turned back to Alara. "Wear one of the new dresses," he said, his gaze gentle. "The blue one. It brings out the color of your eyes." It was the most personal compliment he had ever given her, a small crack in his formal armor that revealed the man within. An hour later, they walked to the courthouse. It was not a long walk, but it felt like a journey across a continent. The news had already flown through redemption. Doors opened, and people stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect for the sheer nerve of their judge. Alara walked beside Alistair, her head held high, her hand resting on his arm. She was no longer Alara Callahan, the town pariah. She was about to become Mrs. Alistair Finch, and the knowledge was a suit of armor. The blue wool of her dress felt solid and real, the weight of Alistair's arm a steadying presence. The main courtroom was a cavern of solemn wood and high windows. Reverend Michael, a thin, wiry man with kind eyes, stood waiting by the judge's bench. Sheriff Brody was there, looking bewildered and out of his depth. And at the back of the room, drawn by an irresistible pull, were Silas Croft and his allies, including Mrs. Crawford. They had come to gloat, to witness what they thought would be Alistair's capitulation. Their smug expressions faltered as Alistair and Alara walked to the front, not as judge and supplicant, but as a couple. Alistair turned to face them, his voice ringing out in the silent room, the familiar cadence of a judge addressing his court. "Mr. Croft, ladies and gentlemen, you came to my home this morning, citing concerns for the morality and good name of this town. You demanded that I cast out a woman who has suffered enough grief and hardship to last a lifetime. You passed judgment without a trial, and you sought to enforce a sentence born of prejudice and malice." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. His gaze was like ice. "You have misjudged me, and you have profoundly misjudged the law. The law is not a weapon for the powerful to wield against the vulnerable. It is a shield, and today I intend to demonstrate that." He turned to Alara, taking both of her hands in his. He faced the preacher. "Reverend, we are here to be married." A collective gasp went through the room. Croft's jaw dropped, his face turning a shade of puce. Mrs. Crawford looked as if she might faint. This was not the outcome they had envisioned. They had meant to drive a wedge between the judge and the outcast. Instead, they had forged a bond of iron. Reverend Michael, who had clearly been briefed, opened his Bible. His voice was calm and steady as he began the ceremony. The words, so often spoken in churches decorated with flowers, took on a different power in the starkness of the courtroom. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. Each phrase was a brick in the wall of their new life. For worse, Alara thought of the whispers, the hunger, the illness. They had already known the worst. In sickness, she thought of him bathing her brow in the fever-ridden room. He had already proven his vow before he had spoken it. When it was time for the declarations, Alistair's voice was firm, resonant with conviction. "Ido." Then all eyes turned to Alara. In that moment, she felt the full weight of their scrutiny. But it was different now. It was not the predatory gaze of the pack, but the baffled stare of the defeated. She looked at Alistair, at the unwavering strength in his face. She thought of her unborn child, who would now have a name, a father in the eyes of the law, a place of safety in this harsh world. She thought of Hinto, and knew that his honorable spirit would understand that this was an act of love, a mother's fierce, desperate love. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear and strong, filled with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Ido." Silas Croft, seeing his power evaporate, could not contain his rage. "This is a sham, a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage," he bellowed from the back of the room. "He's doing it to hide his sin. That child is no more a Lakota's than I am." Before Alistair could respond, Alara turned. She faced the rancher, her eyes blazing with a fire that had been banked for too long. "My child," she said, her voice ringing with a mother's protective fury, "is the son of Hinto Callahan, a man whose honor you are not fit to speak of. He was my husband, and I loved him. This child is a testament to that love. And this man, she turned, placing her hand on Alistair's chest, is the man who has shown me that honor and decency did not die with him. You speak of sin, Mr. Croft, but the only sin in this room is the hatred in your heart. Her words, so pure and freighted with truth, struck the room silent. She had found her voice. She was no longer a victim to be defended. She was a woman standing in her own power, defending her past and her future. Alistair looked down at her, a profound admiration in his eyes. He turned to the sheriff. Sheriff Brody, remove that man from my courtroom. He is disrupting a legal proceeding. Defeated, shamed, and outmaneuvered, Croft allowed himself to be ushered out, sputtering impotent threats. Mrs. Crawford and the others scurried after him like rats from a freshly lit fire. Reverend Michael pronounced them husband and wife. Alistair leaned in, and in the solemn quiet of the courtroom, he gently kissed her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. A seal on a contract that was so much more than law. It was a covenant of two lonely souls against the world. They walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, husband and wife. The air of redemption seemed different, the dust less cruel. Some of the onlookers who had gathered stared with a new kind of wonder. They had witnessed not a scandal, but a display of courage and conviction that few of them possessed. A few men, hesitantly at first, tipped their hats. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. A systemic shift, a crack in the wall of prejudice. Back in the house, the silence that greeted them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of the day, with the gravity of the vows they had taken. It was the silence of shared future. Alara stood in the sitting room, touching the back of a chair, as if to assure herself it was all real. Alistair came and stood beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth from him. I did not do this to trap you, Alara, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the garden outside. When the child is born and you are strong, if you should ever wish for a different life, I will not stand in your way. She turned to him, her heart aching with a gratitude so immense it was painful. You have given my child a name and a future. You have given me a home. Where else would I go? This is my life now, Alistair. Our life. In the weeks that followed, the house on the west side of town truly became a home. The last vestiges of formality between them fell away, replaced by a quiet, comfortable intimacy. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. He learned the names of the Lakota constellations she pointed out in the night sky. She learned about his life in Philadelphia, about the quiet, scholarly woman named Mary he had loved and lost. They were two people from different worlds, building a new one together in the shelter of their shared house. When her time came, it was Alistair who held her hand, Alistair who coached her breathing, his calm, steady voice a rock in her sea of pain. And when her son was born, a beautiful, healthy baby with Alara's dark hair and a fierce, determined cry, it was Alistair who was the first to hold him. He looked down at the tiny, perfect infant wrapped in a blanket, his stern judge's face transformed by a look of absolute wonder. He looked up at Alara, her face tired but radiant. He has your eyes, Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. He will have your name, she replied softly, and your strength. We will call him Daniel. Daniel Hinto Finch. Later that evening, Alistair sat in his study, the empty silence of his past life a distant memory. The house was filled with the soft sounds of a new family. He wasn't reading a law book. He was holding the small, beaded Lakota moccasin that Alara had made months ago. He ran his thumb over the intricate pattern, the symbol for a strong heart. From the other room, he could hear Alara humming a soft tune to their son, a gentle Lakota lullaby that spoke of rivers and stars. He closed his eyes, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. He had come to redemption seeking solitude and order. He had defended a stranger out of a sense of justice, and in doing so, had found his own redemption. The house was no longer silent. It was a home, and his heart, for the first time in a very long time, was full. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.